You're listening to The Globalists, first broadcast on the 21st of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
Today is about Moldova, and it's about voting for a peaceful and free country.
Maya Sandu, speaking after she cast her vote in the Moldovan elections, will examine the consequential polls that took place in the country over the weekend and whether she's held on to her position as president of the country. As Israel bombs Beirut and Netanyahu alleges an assassination attempt, we'll catch up with the latest developments in the Middle East. And we'll have analysis of Joko Widodo's rule in Indonesia, which came to an end yesterday, and ask what the future holds for the country of 280 million people. We'll flick through the international papers, have a roundup of art news, and then...
So the coffee culture, the piazza, that were very influential back in the day, now are maybe less important.
We'll hear from the organiser of Utopian Hours, Europe's leading festival on city making and innovation. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Pennsylvania's Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro has called on law enforcement to investigate billionaire Elon Musk for his promise at a weekend pro-Trump rally to give away $1 million each day until the election. Tens of thousands of pro-EU demonstrators staged a rally in Tbilisi, Georgia on Sunday, a week before parliamentary elections that will decide the country's future path in Europe. And Cuba's electrical grid collapsed again yesterday, the fourth such failure in 48 hours, with a hurricane making landfall to compound the island's misery and threaten further havoc on its decrepit infrastructure. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, yesterday, Moldova conducted two polls, one to elect a president and the second, a referendum on whether the country should join the European Union or not. Well, I'm joined now by Paula Erizanu, who's Moldovan-Romanian journalist in Chisinau, and by Kadri Leek, an Estonian journalist and a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you both. I know you've been anxiously watching these results all evening or all this early morning. Paula, do we have any preliminary results on either vote?
Yes, so 98% of the votes have been counted, and at the moment the referendum has a tight margin. There's yes is winning only by like 50.8%, so there's a difference of a few thousand votes between yes and no.
And what about the presidential election?
In the presidential elections, Maya Sandu has come first with 41% of the vote, 42%, and she's followed closely by former Press Secretary General Alexander Stoyanoglu. So this means we will have a second round, presidential round. Sandu did better than 4 years ago in the first round of presidential elections. We will see what the result will be in 2 weeks' time.
Now, you say, of course, that it's very, very tight on the EU referendum. I wonder if there's a minimum number of votes required to validate the EU referendum. I mean, one survey suggests that 40% of Moldovans living abroad are between 30 and 44 years old. And, of course, they are more likely to vote for integration. Can they do so from abroad?
Yes, so the turnout has been good. 51% of people on the electoral kind of records have come out to vote. That's 1.5 million. And in the diaspora, we've had, I think, about 240,000 people vote in polling stations opened everywhere, including London. And there were massive queues. Some people traveled thousands of kilometers from where they live to the closest embassy or polling station. And also we've had the postal vote inaugurated for people living in Canada and the US. But what I have,
carry on.
What I have to add is that last night at 1 a.m., incumbent Sanders' press briefing said something quite crucial, and that is that she basically sees the vote as rigged, and that comes from information and evidence that the criminal network led by Shore and funded by millions of dollars from Russia has bought 300,000 votes, which is just an astonishing number. And it's double what the police and the security services mentioned in a press briefing a few days ago, which was still an astonishing number, and it's confirmed by investigative journalists who have gone undercover in these networks.
Will there be any action taken on this Russian interference?
Well, that is the question, whether the Electoral Commission will validate the referendum and the presidential elections, and whether the Constitutional Court will declare this election and the referendum constitutional.
Kadri, if we could come to you, if Moldovans do vote to join the EU, and it looks like even despite this interference they might, will they actually get in?
Well, getting into the EU was always going to take a long time. And the meaning of that referendum is a little bit different. That is not the legal, should I join the EU or not referendum. That normally happens at late stage of accession negotiations, when the actual deal with the EU, what will it actually mean to join, has already been negotiated. I mean, when Estonia joined, I think we had it 6 months or 8 months before accession. What Moldova voted for was not that referendum, but it set the political direction. The question is, should we enshrine accession to the EU as a goal in our constitution? So it really was about geopolitical direction. And if the result is so narrow, I think that actually weakens the government that intends to pursue European integration based on that vote. So everything will be harder for them. The EU, of course, will still be there and offering its support to Moldova, especially if Maia Sandu wins the presidential election. But I think her own mandate inside the country is weakened, unless investigation really brings out something dramatic about Russian interference that will allow to have a different look at the whole thing.
And Kadri, if Moldova does join the EU, and as you say, we're still some way away from that, what would it mean to the rest of the bloc?
Well, Moldova being a small country, it will actually be easy to integrate. It will not endanger anyone's vested interests, be it French agriculture, Polish agriculture, whatnot. I think integration would be easy. Of course, I mean, each additional country makes it a little bit harder to govern the EU. You need new distribution of posts, commissioners, parliament, etc. So eventually there are questions, how far can EU expand before renovating how it works. But Moldova will not be what tips the scales in this respect. Rather, Ukraine will be a lot harder to integrate.
And do you think that we can expect a Russian reaction to this result? Clearly, it's something they're trying to prevent. If it does go ahead, it's going to anger Putin.
Oh, definitely. And I think if Russia has been trying to influence the result, that is exactly what they have in mind. And I think they are already celebrating in Moscow because a narrow majority for the EU will allow them to say that, well, see, your country is split half to half. People in Paris might vote to join the EU, but people in Chisinau maybe do not. So definitely Russian propaganda will make the most of it.
Well, I would have to interfere here to say that people in Chisinau did vote for the EU. It's in other parts of the country that are more rural that people voted against it. And also something that I wanted to add is that the question phrased in the referendum was quite clunky. It's like, do you support modifying the constitution with the EU integration of Moldova in sight, which is a lot less clear than it could have been.
And Paula, just back to the presidential election result. As you say, it's unclear. It is going to go to a runoff. What does the future look like under either candidate?
Well, if Maya Sandu wins the next round and becomes president again, this will mean that she will try to kind of continue Moldova's reforms and EU integration. But of course, we have parliamentary elections next summer. And people were more optimistic about this referendum and this presidential election than the parliamentary elections. So that's going to be another hoop to jump through. The other scenario, when Alexander Stoyanoglu wins elections, basically means that Moldova will probably transform into something quite similar to Georgia under the Georgian Dream. So a declared kind of pro-European government, but with a Russian agenda and with Russian links.
Paula, thank you very much indeed. That's Paula Erezanu, and thank you also to Kadri Leek there. This is The Globalist. It is 9:12 in Beirut, 7:12 here in London. To the Middle East now, where hundreds of Beirut residents fled their homes late last night with multiple explosions heard across the Lebanese capital as Israel attacked sites linked to the financial operations of Lebanon's Hezbollah group and told people to leave those areas immediately. A day earlier, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said a drone launched from Lebanon that targeted his residence was an attempt by Hezbollah to assassinate him. Well, I'm joined now by Paul Rogers, who's Open Democracy's international security expert. Paul, many thanks for coming back on the show. Can you tell us about those explosions last night?
Well, it seems that what the Israelis are now trying to do is to damage Hezbollah indirectly. And this is by attempting to basically delay any financial supplies coming through from Iran. It's a wider tactic. Obviously, it doesn't do anything directly in the short term. But I think it shows to Hezbollah that the IDF will go to almost any length that it can to try and damage them. I think the problem for the IDF is that they've been doing a great deal of bombing in right across Lebanon, particularly in Beirut. They have troops on the ground. But Hezbollah is still sending 60 or 70 missiles and rockets through into Israel every day. And I think they're really trying to spread this net very wide. But at the same time, this means a considerable increase in civilian casualties in Lebanon. But I think it does show the determination of the IDF to continue the war. And one has to say that the idea there's going to be any kind of ceasefire in the short term is just not there. It is not going to happen. And that is not the way that the IDF sees things, and certainly not the way that Netanyahu sees things. And I think this apparent attack on him personally is a further indication of the state of affairs that we have.
I mean, you say it's not going to end, but there are reports that Israel gave the United States a document last week with its conditions for a diplomatic solution to end the war in Lebanon. What more do we know about that?
Very little about that. And we also know, of course, that there's been an interesting leak on the United States side of a possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran. And I think one has to recognize that there's been a lot happening here behind the scenes. The United States has put in its most modern air defense system into Israel. and that is with American troops actually stationed in Israel to do this. This is in addition to the ones already there looking after the X-band radar down in the Negev desert. And you've also seen this extraordinary demonstration attack, I think the best thing to call it, where the B-2 stealth bomber was used to do deep penetration bombing of 5 different targets down in Yemen, all connected with the Houthi weapons stores. So I think the United States is very closely connected on this. And, one would hope that the Israelis are prepared for some sort of diplomatic settlement. But frankly, I don't see any sign of it. And I think very few analysts do. What is being said in public, I'm afraid, seems to be rather different from what is happening in private. I think the possibility of a major attack on Iran in the next 2 weeks is actually much higher than people are reckoning.
Now, Hezbollah says its conflict with Israel's reached a new phase. What do they mean by that?
Difficult to say. Again, this is the kind of statement that is coming out from the different sides, whether it's the Israelis, the Hezbollah, or where the rare occasions you get now any kind of message from Hamas. It's difficult to say. I think Hezbollah recognizes that this is potentially a long war. I put as much as that. There isn't going to be a short ending because Hezbollah does not intend to stop its ability to fire the missiles, and the Israelis, I think, are absolutely determined to continue it. What one has to recognize is this is at a time where you really do have smoking mirrors, and it's really difficult to tell what is really intended. But I have to say, I think the best guess is that Israel does intend to keep this on, certainly until after the American election, because much will depend there, and we're only a fortnight away from that.
I wonder how the killing of Yahya Sinwar has changed the landscape for Netanyahu. I mean, he does seem to have had a bump in popularity.
He certainly has. I mean, it's been quite a change for him. In fact, if you look at what has happened in the last, 5 or maybe 6 weeks, there's been a complete turnaround in his position. And although many Israelis are really very dubious about him and his personality and what he does, the fact that Sinwar is actually being killed in this way is an indication which goes down very well with many Israelis. How long that will last is another matter, because obviously you still have, 60,000 Israelis who are displaced from close to the Lebanese border. But for the moment, I think Netanyahu is in a very strong position and would want to continue that for as long as possible, certainly through into the next American election presidency.
I wonder what this means for the outlook for the hostages. I mean, do we know how many are left, and is their fate still a priority for Netanyahu?
We don't know how many are left. I think, sadly, some more may well have died because, obviously, hostages are sometimes kept underground, sometimes in buildings actually in the open, and a number have been killed in the Israeli airstrikes, and some have been executed, apparently, as far as we know, by Hamas supporters. So we don't know what the situation is. There's getting on for 100, and their situation obviously is very dire. They've been held hostage now for over a year, many of them underground for most of that time. But that's where we are, and it seems to me that this is not as major a factor as far as Netanyahu is concerned as one might expect. And one of the changes over the last year has been, before then, Israel would move heaven and earth to rescue even 1, 2, or 3 hostages. Now I think it has changed in the middle of this war. And what it becomes much more important is actually to try and destroy Hamas. And it may well be that to some extent, in some of the thinking within the Netanyahu administration, not across the whole of government, in some of the thinking, I think essentially the hostages just do not have the importance they had a year or so ago.
Now, US President Joe Biden was in Berlin last week. He was discussing the conflict with Chancellor Schulz. And we also heard from the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Joseph Borrell. Is Europe changing its attitude on the war?
That's very difficult to say. I mean, as far as one can tell, the British still are very, very supporters of the Americans, are certainly heavily involved in intelligence gathering and other matters. In a number of other countries, I think there is a change in attitude that may be in connection with all the uncertainty you have about whether Trump is going to get in. And we've been sort of changing that in the last sort of 2 months. It's gone one way or then the other. That at the moment it looks slightly more likely that Trump will get in again. But I think the Europeans as a whole are very much undecided. There are different views in different countries. I mean, it's clear that Macron in France takes a much stronger view, which I think will be considered anti-Israeli in many quarters, compared with the Germans. And they're the two major countries as far as setting the the view from Europe. For the moment, I think there is a slight loss in support for Israel, and that is expressed in different ways in a number of countries, most notably in France at the present time.
So, I mean, is there any consensus then on what the day after looks like?
No, there isn't. And I think we do not know from Israel what they would really want, because, again, you're getting very widespread views, hugely different views. Many Israelis essentially just want the problem to go away. But how is a very different matter. There are some elements, there are minority elements within the Netanyahu government who want to carry on this war and even see what people call, basically crudely, the ethnic cleansing of many Palestinians, certainly from Gaza. That's a tiny minority, but at the same time it is there and does hold at least influence in the Netanyahu government because of the nature of the current government. And one has to remember that will not change quickly because of the way in which Israel has long-term election campaigns. You cannot go to the country almost overnight, at least not, I would suspect, unless in exceptional circumstances. So I think where we are is into the big unknown. But all you can say is that as far as the evidence suggests, Israel is determined to carry on, and there is certainly a strong possibility of extending it to Iran in the fairly short term, possibly really very quickly.
Paul Rogers, thank you very much indeed. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me in the studio is Charles Hecker, who is an author, Zero Sum. His book is about to come out next month, very exciting. He's also a risk analyst. Charles, good morning to you.
Good morning, Georgina.
Let's look at this story. Now, it's reported everywhere. We're taking the FT's version of this. I am finding it almost incomprehensible that there should be any doubt that it's illegal for Elon Musk to give cash to people for turning up at Trump rallies.
Well, you're right. Just as you mentioned at the very top of the broadcast, we're going to the absolute street carnival now that is the U.S. elections, particularly regarding Elon Musk and particularly in the state of Pennsylvania. So Musk is now giving out $1 million a day, lottery style, to people who sign a petition in Pennsylvania. And you're absolutely right to suggest that this should be illegal, and that is exactly what the governor of Pennsylvania thinks, who is pushing for Musk to be investigated. And the headline from the FT said, Elon Musk under fire over $1 million prize offer for voters who signed petition. And this is exactly the fine line that Elon Musk is walking. He is not, technically speaking, paying people to vote. The petition that he's asking people to sign is in support of freedom of speech and the right to bear arms. And so what he's saying is these are people who are simply just being patriotic and supporting the First and Second Amendments to the Constitution. It's an extremely fine legal line, and what he's really doing is harvesting email addresses for campaign literature.
It's quite extraordinary. What might the ramifications of this be?
Well, I mean, it's getting a little bit, we've only got about 2 weeks until the election. So the ramifications, if they're going to be any, have to start fairly soon. It's not certain that he'll be able to, that the governor of Pennsylvania or anybody in government or in law enforcement will be able to stop this activity prior to the elections. What he's doing is micro-targeting communities in Pennsylvania to try to sway their vote. The other thing that might come out of all of this is that if President Trump wins as a result of the swing in this absolutely crucial state, Elon Musk has been promised a role in government. So it's all quite cozy all the way around.
I mean, I don't want to be dramatic about it, but is this the death of democracy?
Yes and no. People and organizations and individuals and companies have been trying to influence elections ever since elections were invented. And individuals with a lot of money, particularly through the creation of these extremely influential and wealthy political action committees, the PACs, that hold all the real money and all of the real power in campaign financing at the very least. This is now a permanent feature of American elections. And so influence peddling, influence purchasing, and influence trading is regrettably a feature of all of this. It is down to the good citizens of Pennsylvania to try to filter through the propaganda that's being hurled at them, but it's going to keep coming fast and thick.
Well, talking about the death of democracy, let's talk about Russia, because Alexei Navalny's prison diaries have been published. Tell us about this posthumous memoir.
That's right. There's a beautiful spread in the New York Times called How Alexei Navalny's Prison Diaries Got Published. And you're right, this is in the run-up to the imminent publication of a book called Patriot, which runs to almost 500 pages, the New York Times tells us, and is exactly this. It's the prison diaries from Alexei Navalny, who we will recall died in February of this year at the age of 47 as a result of his imprisonment and mishandling by the Russian criminal justice system. And I use those terms advisedly, especially the word justice. But in any case, Navalny died in prison this year. He was, throughout his imprisonment and following his poisoning in, I think it was 2020, while he was recovering in Germany, he began writing diaries. And then you'll recall that very famously he flew back to Russia, was arrested upon his arrival at the airport in Moscow, and entered the Russian prison system and never left. It's a fantastic story about how his diaries and his letters were sometimes sent out of prison, smuggled out of prison, masked and covered, and at some point almost counterfeited just to get them out and for them to see the light of day. His wife is on a publicity tour that is actually coming to London quite soon. And, this is a much, much, much anticipated sort of diary/memoir.
And she, of course, says that once Putin goes, she will run for president of Russia.
That's right. There's been a recent announcement from Yulia Navalnaya, Alexei Navalny's widow, that when the timing is right, sort of said rather ambitiously that she would run for president. She is at the moment herself in exile as well in Berlin. And so this would involve her returning, obviously, to Russia, which at the moment is probably far too dangerous a move for her. The way she phrased it sort of seemed to indicate that this is something she's contemplating in a post-Putin Russia.
Let's go to Australia now, where King Charles is on a tour there. He's been heckled by an Indigenous Australian senator, but also lauded by an alpaca.
That's right. So this is from a story in The Guardian today. There was a little bit of difficulty anticipated in the King's trip to Australia because Republican sentiment there, of course, is quite high and running strong. His planners, both here in the UK and in Australia, girded themselves against protest. And what happened is that during an appearance in the Australian Parliament, the king was quite harshly criticized openly by an Indigenous senator called Lydia Thorpe, who hurled quite a sort of heavy chain of invective at the king. She was escorted from Parliament, and so I guess this is sort of not exactly what the logistics team was anticipating when the king left for Australia. They thought there might be something more along the lines of sort of the Republican sentiment, but right here in Parliament, he got it right between the eyes, really, from a senator.
And the alpaca wearing a crown. It was a rather sweet picture carried in most of the papers.
Right. Okay.
Let's go to the Japan Times now. I know it's one of your favourite publications, Charles.
That's right. There's always something interesting to read about Japan in the Japan Times, whether it's serious news or something lighthearted or something in between. What the Japan Times tells us today, under the headline, Road Traffic Law Revisions for Cycling Offences to Kick in Next Month, is that it's no more fun to ride a bicycle in Japan anymore. And that is that the laws are being very dramatically tightened for using a mobile phone while you're on a bicycle or for cycling while under the influence of alcohol. And the Japan Times tells us that there are literally thousands of accidents involving cyclists on their phones or having had a bit too much to drink every year. And the fines are actually getting quite frightening. If you are using your phone while cycling and you cause an accident, and that includes hitting a pedestrian, you can be fined up to 300,000 yen, which is in the thousands of dollars, and you can be jailed for up to a year. And if you are driving or cycling under the influence, the fines are even stricter. This is all in an attempt to bring down the 72,000 bicycle accidents that were recorded last year in Japan, many of which resulted in fatalities.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. That's Charles Hecker there. Now, still to come on the programme.
So, in a way, it's one of the things which I've always encouraged my students. Forget your mobiles, because there is a lot of information, but not that much knowledge.
We speak to award-winning architect, poet and artist Richard England. But first, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Tens of thousands of pro-EU demonstrators staged a rally in Tbilisi, Georgia on Sunday, a week before parliamentary elections that will decide the country's future path in Europe. Brussels froze Georgia's EU accession process earlier this year after the ruling Georgian Dream Party passed a controversial foreign influence law targeting civil society. Pennsylvania's Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro called on law enforcement to investigate billionaire Elon Musk for his promise at a weekend pro-Trump rally to give away $1 million each day until Election Day. On Saturday, Musk gave $1 million check to an attendee at the rally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which was hosted by America PAC, a political action group the Tesla CEO set up to back Republican Donald Trump in the November 5th presidential election. And Cuba's electrical grid collapsed again on Sunday, the fourth such failure in 48 hours, with a hurricane making landfall to compound the island's misery and threaten further havoc on its decrepit infrastructure. Earlier, Cuba said it was making headway restoring service after multiple false starts, though millions of people remained without electricity more than 2 days after the grid's initial collapse. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Just coming up to 13:32 in Jakarta, 7:32 here in London. On Sunday, Joko Widodo stepped down as the president of Indonesia after 2 terms and a decade in power. Under his leadership of the nation of 280 million people, there's been strong economic growth and massive infrastructure development. Well, James Chambers is Monocle's Asia editor based in Bangkok and joins me now to look back at Widodo's legacy and what's next for the future of the country. James, I know that you've interviewed Jokowi. Give us a sense of the man.
Hi, Georgina. Yes, I mean, as you said, you highlighted perhaps his 2 big priorities, which was economic growth for Indonesia and infrastructure. And he's done very well at both of those things. He is very much kind of a nationalist, an Indonesia first kind of person. He's famously someone who rose from, I guess, quite humble background. He was a furniture maker and quite a successful businessman, and he came from outside of Jakarta's political families. So he came in 10 years ago as the big disruptor. He was the outsider, and he was promising to kind of develop Indonesia, and he has done. He has done very well on the economic front, but he hasn't been quite so successful in changing the political system.
What do his critics say?
Well, I mean, it's as you said, Georgina. I'm glad you kind of started on a positive, because he has achieved quite a lot. It's just that he set expectations very high. He was going to be the man who changed everything, and as it turns out, he hasn't been able to. Essentially the system has proven too hard to change. So they would accuse Jokowi of not really defending Indonesia's democratic institutions. He's been a kind of a politician who's been very good at convincing everybody to get on side, to join his cabinet, to join his huge government. And that was his way of basically eliminating any opposition. So he could achieve these big things like building this huge new capital because he convinced everyone to be on his side. And so in a way, people are saying that he's leaving Indonesia's democracy in, if not a weaker, but not a better, stronger position than when he took over. And they wouldn't say that he is an arch Democrat. He's a builder. He wanted to improve Jakarta. That was his focus, and he was willing to, I guess, use his skills of persuasion to get people on board.
And tell us about the new government. Who's in the cabinet?
Well, so the new government under the new president, Prabowo Subianto, he owes his position to Jokowi. Jokowi goes out with a very, very, very popular rating, about 75% approval rating. And if it wasn't for his backing, Prabowo wouldn't have become president, that's for sure. He lost twice before to Jokowi, and it was only when Jokowi kind of gave voters the impression that he had his backing that he suddenly saw an upswing in his popularity. And we should note that Prabowo's running mate, the new vice president, is Jokowi's son. So there were some, behind the scenes deals. So this new government is very much meant to be a continuation of the Jokowi government. And if we look at Prabowo's cabinet, he's appointed a huge cabinet. I mean, Jokowi had about 34 ministers. Prabowo is pushing 50. And on the economic front, and on the kind of finance ministry, he's kept Jokowi's people in place. So you can see there that he's going to continue the policies that Jokowi had on the economy, but he has made some bold claims, Prabowo, that he's going to grow the economy by 8% a year, which is would be quite staggering, because I think Jokowi managed about 5%, which was incredible during the last 10 years, and Prabowo wants to go for 8%. What we see the difference is probably on foreign affairs and foreign policy. Jokowi wasn't really interested in anything outside of Indonesia. He just wanted to see his country, grow and get more prosperous. Whereas Prabowo, everyone knows him as an ex-military general, but he spent most of his childhood abroad. He speaks about 4 or 5 languages. He's very worldly, and I think we'll see him more on the international stage. He does want to make Indonesia more assertive. I mean, Indonesia is a huge country. It should have a bigger voice, and he's the one who wants to speak louder. But he has made the important point that Indonesia is non-aligned, and he's got no intention of changing that.
Now, there have been protests. They started last August after Parliament proposed election changes. Are there still protests? How happy do people on the ground feel about this change in leadership?
Well, I mean, the Jokowi is standing down because he's term limited. Under the Indonesian constitution, you can only run for 2 terms. His 10 years was interrupted by COVID. So a few years ago, there was some chat that he might try and extend his term. And let's be honest, if presidents could run for 3 terms in Indonesia, there's no doubt that the people would vote in Jokowi for another term. So they'll be sad to see him go, but clearly they are happy to see he will have his son still involved in the new government. But the problem with Jokowi is that he came into power saying that he was going to change all the political dynasties, the families who run Indonesian politics, the big Jakarta families, which Prabowo is a part of. But actually, he has, in a sense, become one himself. He's got his son now as VP, and people around him, if it wasn't him, tried to change the rules to get his youngest son able to run for a governor of Central Java. So there's been protests about some of the things that Jokowi has done, but right now, when it comes to Prabowo, he's only been sworn in yesterday. He ran a very good campaign. He won 58% of the vote. It's very convincing. And he's kind of trying to, create this image of himself as some kind of cuddly grandpa. So even though some of the headlines in the Western newspapers will be about his history as a military general who committed all these human rights abuses in the 90s, these days he's 73 years old. He's moved into the presidential palace with his cat, and he's trying to push the image of himself as a cuddly grandpa. And one of his flagship policies, which will be amazing if he can actually achieve it, is to provide free school meals for every school child in Indonesia, which is over 80 million people. And that'll cost about $4.5 billion in the first year. So, I mean, if he can achieve that without bankrupting the country, that'll be, great for school kids in Indonesia. But let's see how he gets on.
James, thank you very much indeed. That's James Chambers, Monocle's Asia editor. And this is Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. Now, Richard England is an award-winning architect, poet and artist who aims to give poetry to the pragmatic. During a distinguished career, Richard has created a canon of regionalist architecture, particularly in his native Malta, that's built from a strong sense of place and rooted in local materials. Monocle's Hassan Anderson caught up with Richard at Monocle's Quality of Life conference in Istanbul to discuss further the relationship between architecture, philosophy and poetry. Hassan began by asking Richard about the parallels he draws between Istanbul and Malta.
Well, first of all, I think Nick had some digs about the age I've reached, but I kept saying that although one grows old, one does not necessarily grow up. And I think it's terribly important to remember that man dies when the last part of the child in him becomes an adult. My architecture philosophy is based on the fact that I believe architecture does not really travel very well. So I believe in an architecture of its time, but more so of its place. But I believe in an architecture which enhances the soul and also uplifts the spirit. For mood is very much affected by space. In other words, space is mood manipulative. So the job of the architect really is to make the ordinary extraordinary and to create ambiences which actually move the soul and move the spirit. I believe very much in the words of C.S. Lewis, and in a way they reflect my approach. While others were building ships in their bottles, I was striving to build a lighthouse.
That's one of the many wonderful quotes that you brought out in your talk today. It struck me how much philosophy has played a part in your work with architecture. How much does theory mean to you, and how much do you keep it in mind when you are working?
Well, quite a lot, because I'm an avid reader, and there are a number of books which have, in a way, formed my basic philosophy. I refer particularly to Gaston Bachelard, to Italo Calvino, and Monocle. So, in a way, it's one of the things which I've always encouraged my students. Forget your mobiles, because there is a lot of information, but not that much knowledge. So I've always strived at the end to use literature, because I also write poetry. And poetry is not that different from architecture, because it's building with words as opposed to building with materials. It's about sound and silence, while in architecture it's about solid and void. And the one thing I want to pass on to students in relation to drawing is, for God's sake, use your hand, because the bridge between mind and paper is really still best crossed by the hand. Don't let the mouse eat the pencil.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about the relationship between poetry and architecture, because I think it's quite interesting. I mean, I'm aware that the word stanza, for example, means room in Italian, and there is that connection between physical space and poetry. But what does that mean for you, that relationship?
Well, it means absolutely determinant point of my departure, because I believe architecture is visual and spatial poetry, while poetry is about the lexicon, about the choice of words, and, as I said before, the sound and silence. While in architecture, it's the ambience and the materials one chooses in order to enrich the quality of life, because this is what we're talking about. You see, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us, so we must remember this. My basic philosophy, if I could actually find a way of looking back, I would say that I have believed in trying to create an architecture where the floor is the earth, the walls are the wind, and the ceiling is the sky.
I suppose as a sort of final question for some of our listeners, when they approach a city like Istanbul or anywhere else in the world, and they want to, in the same way as a poet reader might have to gain experience to gain from the page, how would you do that when it comes to architecture, to sort of absorb the mood and learn to read the city?
Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian blind author and poet, was once questioned why he still travelled, the fact that he was blind, and he said, "It is far more important to feel a place than to see it." And I think that's what one should strive when walking through the atmosphere, absorbing the very, very feeling of a city.
That was Richard England talking to Monocle's Hassan Anderson there. And this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's time now to talk arts and culture news with the journalist Emma Rose Abrams, who joins me right now in the studio. Welcome to you. I know it's been an exhausting couple of weeks. There was Frieze, and then you've been in Paris for Art Basel.
Yes, I just got back from Paris. Well, I got back on Friday, but I think mentally I got back yesterday. It's been full on. It's this 2-week period we have now after Art Basel Paris kind of took over FIAC and brought the calendar much closer together. And now in its third year, moving into the Grand Palais, which has been refurbished, despite there being a leak, which was one of the biggest news items of the week, with water dripping through the roof. It was a dramatic kind of reopening of the fair. It was seen as the first of the, even though it's in its third edition, it's the first time where it's really been able to be in its full location and in this kind of very grand, beautiful setting with a lot more galleries and a lot more space.
And what were the big ticket items at this year's fair?
Well, I mean, there was a Louise Bourgeois sold by Hauser & Wirth for 20 million and a Julie Moretu for about 8 million. These are huge sums of money, but compared to Art Basel in Basel, this is still not the huge items that we're seeing. And I think kind of what we're kind of seeing from the impact of Art Basel Paris is actually a little bit more moderation. The approach in France, in Paris, seems to be, rather than what we have in London a lot of the time, which is come in, you see the thing you want, you buy it, and it's quite competitive and it's buy on the first day. Whereas in Paris, which kind of goes with the market we're seeing at the moment, bit of a downturn, people still buying, people still interested in purchasing these huge big ticket art items and pieces, but with a bit more thought behind it. So a bit, maybe put something on hold on the first day, come back on the weekend and think about actually making that purchase. So it's a kind of like a slightly more moderated approach. The sale's still happening, but not these huge, huge prices, and a bit more thought going into making that actual final decision.
I mean, I've been talking to gallerists around London, and everybody is saying the same thing. They're just not selling like they used to.
Absolutely, they aren't. But people are now beginning to question whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, people need to make their bottom line. This is an expensive city. People need to pay the rent. And there's all these kind of very fundamental things at play here. But yes, I mean, it's just not that kind of walk in and buy market anymore, or it's not for now.
Well, if you had Mellon Foundation money, of course, it would be no problem. They've launched a $25 million fund to support culture along the US-Mexico border.
Yeah, I thought this was really, really interesting. Because, I mean, the fund, it's $25 million that supports 32 grants to 32 grants, 8 of which are in Mexico, the rest are in the US. And it's kind of runs along the border, which is 2,000 miles, and it's 6 Mexican states with 4 US states. So it's this huge, varied kind of part of the country, but obviously that has a lot of tensions running over, and it often gets used in these kind of political conversations. It can come up. So I thought it was quite interesting to try and create a dialogue, because while most of the investment seems to be in the US, across museums, universities, different cultural institutions, it will naturally, I think, maybe create some kind of relationship beyond immigration and border across that area. Do you think?
Very interesting. 25 million to 25 years. I have to tell you what I did this weekend.
Oh, tell me.
The Lion King is 25. And yesterday there was this fantastic performance and then a party for people involved with the production, or new people in the production.
Wonderful.
And so on every chair there was a little stuffed Simba, which everybody held up, as the babies held up at the beginning. And there was just so much joy in the theatre because everybody was kind of connected in some way. And then afterwards, everybody trooped off to the Waldorf for this kind of wonderful celebration of this show. But what's extraordinary about it, so Julie Taymor, she's one of the world's most innovative directors. And in fact, I think this was her first big directorial debut.
No, really?
She was the first woman to win a Tony Award. The production is now, I think, in how many? It's in 20. There are 25 global productions in 9 different languages, including they are English, Japanese, German, Korean, French, Dutch, Spanish, Mandarin, and Portuguese. And an extraordinary thing happened at the end of the show. So they do the whole show, and then it kind of ends, and everybody's weeping, of course, because it's the Lion King, and you do. Then Julie gives a little chat. The curtain goes up again. There were 5 Rafikis from productions all over the world.
Oh my goodness.
Just doing that fantastic kind of opening number. And it was just the theatre erupted. I cannot tell you how joyful this was. And I think that's an amazing thing about theatre like that, the way it really can get to you in a visceral way.
It's that face-to-face thing, isn't it? It's being in the room with the performer and connecting with the people around you. And when the story is so fundamental, when it touches you so much, there's nothing like it.
Yeah, that whole circle of life thing, such a great teaching tool as well for children, and quite a lot of kids. I mean, my own daughter was in the auditorium weeping because this was her childhood, and it's a show that's really affected so many people across the world. Anyway, hats off to Julie, who was amazing, and it was just a great evening. Emma Rose, thank you so much for coming in to speak to us. Emma Rose Abrams there, and this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Utopian Hours 2024, the 8th edition of Europe's leading festival on city making and innovation, took place in Turin this weekend. Well, Ed Stocker is Monocle's Europe editor, and he was there. Ed, what is Utopian Hours and what caught your eye this year?
Yeah, I mean, Utopian Hours is essentially an urbanism conference, except it's more fun than a conference. It actually bills itself as a festival, and it really is a celebration of urbanism, of mobility, of city making, and it's, as you said, it takes place in Turin in Piedmont in northern Italy every year, and it's kind of one of the remarkable things about it is just the sort of crowd it draws. It draws a really cool young crowd. I'm not saying all urbanism festivals draw older crowds, but no, it is quite notable that there's lots of sort of students there and younger people, lots of people vigorously taking notes, and over 30 keynote speakers from around the world. And it's just really interesting to see how they all sort of mingle. They hang out in the evening for meals, sort of exchange ideas, and a lot comes out of it. I mean, there was just, so much to really dig into. We had the Chief Public Realm Officer from New York City, Yating Lui, who was actually also a little plug for the Monocle Quality of Life Conference. She was also at Monocle's QOL conference last year in Munich. We had Martin Evans from Lansec in the UK. There was just brilliant speakers, really, from all around the globe, from Thailand to Tallinn.
I mean, this was the 8th edition. What were your takeaways from this 2024 edition of the show?
Well, I've got a lot of takeaways, but actually, this is the moment I want to hand over to Stratospherica. This is the organisation behind Utopian Hours, and Giacomo Biraghi, who's one of the co-founders, if you like, of the festival, along with Luca Ballerini. Let's hear from him.
My biggest takeaway this year, one, we was very disputed, is how Europe is losing ground in a way towards public space in cities, towards the US way. We witnessed the High Line as a product that is now selling all over the world in different shape and way, or technical urbanism, or this new job title. I mean, how it comes that New York appointed a director for public realm before an European city. So the coffee culture, the piazza that were very influential back in the day, now are maybe less important. And the second main takeaway, in my opinion, would be the power of cities, the power of mayor. Back 10 years ago, Benjamin Barber wrote the famous book, If Mayor Ruled the World. We witnessed today that maybe it's not the case. National government and federal government are setting the stage, and the influence of cities are maybe decreasing. We heard also from a photographer today about these new capital cities that are building everywhere for different reasons, how they are literally nation-shaped project without any bottom-up or local influence. So that's my biggest takeaway of this edition of Utopian Hours.
That was Giacomo Biraghi from Stratospherica. Do you agree with what he said, Ed?
There's a lot to unpick there, isn't there, Georgina? I mean, taking the first part of his answer, which was basically saying that, the US is leading the way when it comes to public realm. He mentioned the fact that they have a public realm officer, and that's a big deal that, they've gone and named someone. It's the first in New York. Certainly, look, there's a lot, I think, that cities around the world can learn from the US, particularly New York. You see it here in Milan, where I'm based, the sort of ideas of little mini intervention pocket parks, things like that have long been pioneered in New York, has sort of been copied here. He also mentioned the High Line. We had field operations, which was one of the main landscape architects involved in the High Line, and the fact that has indeed been copied and recopied some more all around the world. So those things are true. But actually, I spoke to Matt Grunbaum, who's from field operations, the people behind the High Line. And he was, he's from Australia, he's based in New York. And he was saying, look, when I come to Turin, I'm inspired by the piazza, the coffee culture, seeing this outdoor life. So it's not all one-way traffic. I think a lot of people from the US are also inspired by the sort of compact urban way people live, the heritage parks that we have in European cities, and this sort of outdoor seating lifestyle that hasn't exactly managed to be entirely copied in the US. And I think in terms of the second point, I don't know if we've got enough time to unpack all of that, but if you look at sort of how cities reacted during the presidency of Donald Trump, it proves that there is still life in cities. Yeah, absolutely. And mayors have power.
Ed, thank you very much indeed. And that's Ed Stocker. And that's all we have time for today. Thanks to our producers, Angelica Jobson, Chris Chomak, Hassan Anderson, our researchers, Sana Jamani, and our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and The Briefing will be live at midday in London. And The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.